Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Leading Innovation at Work, the Future of Business. I'm your host, Lorri Rollinson, and in today's episode, we're going to be learning from Gabrielle Redding. How are you, Gabrielle?
I'm good, thank you.
Excellent. Gabrielle is a recent graduate of the New York Institute of Technology, and she is a Bachelor of Architecture, and she's continuing her education at Harvard University in the Master of Design Studies program. And she's concentrating in risk in resilience, which I know is a very important topic in the built environment, especially as risks are changing so rapidly and they're growing in different factions. So risk management has been in the top 3 areas of focus for most real estate leaders and development. Her current work is focused on inclusive and feminist public spaces and redefining the responsibility that designers and architects have in forming nonviolent environments and spaces. I just thought it was such a great topic. I couldn't pass the opportunity to have you on the show and help her meet you all. And please do ping her on social media, reach out if what you hear is of interest and you can help her in any way. I know she's fairly in the early stages of her career, but I think she's going to be an amazing future leader. She's got a bright future. And in fact, I think she's already a leader on this topic, and she's giving substance to a topic that's not quite frankly widely understood or discussed. And I really appreciate your efforts to elevate the understanding of public safety and women in architecture and design. So thank you so much, Gabrielle.
Well, thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction. I'd love to walk through some of the work I've done over the past year and a half or so, and just give a little bit of context, feminist placemaking. If I could start off with a few questions, just what is feminist placemaking? So this challenges the idea of architecture and design being catered towards one universal citizen, which usually leaves out and ignores an entire scope of those that are affected by the places that we create. So my work explores how various factors in urban design can contribute to conditions that either instigate or they might discourage issues of gender-based violence, particularly sexual harassment and sexual assault. So my work has used a variety of crowdsourced databases, which chronicle people's specific locations where they've experienced gender-based violence. And we can pinpoint that down to specific street corners. So while thousands of these pins exist from women all over the world, there's little existing research to what causes one place to be a higher risk for violence than another. So I want to look at these spaces that have been deemed as high risk and figure out there's a commonality in the urban design factors in between them. So the second question I'd like to answer is, what is street harassment? Street harassment, defined by Holly Curl, who's an author and best known for her book Stop Street Harassment, defines it as unwanted interaction in public space between strangers motivated by a person's actual perceived gender, sexual orientation, or gender expression. And these actions make the person being harassed feel annoyed or angry, humiliated or scared. And it usually can start as something like usually being a catcalling form of street harassment. But people have been stalked, they've been groped, it can escalate to rape. So I think it's really imminent that we focus on how to design space that can deter people from having to experience this type of violence. So I think it is important to note that my work heavily references sexual violence. It does contain very specific accounts of assault and harassment, so it can be a little bit triggering for people. So I'd just like to put that warning out there before I continue. But with that being said, I think it's an incredibly important conversation that does have to be had. And I just want to give some context into how imminent this danger is. This shows issues of street harassment nationwide. We see that over 57% of people, both genders, every type of sexual orientation, have experienced verbal harassment in public. Over 40% have experienced physical aggression. This is a really common issue for people. It begins at a really early age as well. So for most people, they start being harassed in public space while they're teenagers, sometimes younger, and that continues throughout people's lives. And what's been disturbing to me as someone that studies architecture and urban design and has worked in these environments is seeing that people have reported changes in how they perceive their surroundings. So I find that as a sign that we've failed as designers. We should be able to just design a space that is inclusive and safe. And while harassment starts for many people when they're young, it's usually repeated through their lives. So for women, if they're harassed once, there's over an 80% chance that's going to continue for them. And we see that roughly 40% of women just don't feel safe walking alone by themselves at night, and this is worldwide. So what can we do to change how people feel when they walk through space? And as architects and urban designers and forces in adjacent fields, like where does our responsibility lie in creating an environment that feels safe? As soon as we alter the built environment, it becomes our responsibility to make sure that that is safe. And I don't want to negate that it doesn't just affect women. Members of the LGBTQ community are at a very high risk as well. So I'd like to include them in this conversation. Men also, like heterosexual men, also experience this type of crime, but it disproportionately affects women and members of this community. So where do we start in trying to determine what makes a space unsafe? Across most studies in regards to the prevalence of sexual assault and harassment, public transportation has always been cited as a very high-risk area. You can see here that the majority of harassment in public space takes place on the street, in general public spaces, and in public transportation. 20% of women nationwide have been harassed on public transit. This includes communities where public transit might just be a couple bus lines. This includes places like New York and LA with massive transit systems. And then we also see that for women, their preferred mode of nighttime transportation is usually not public transit. It'll be a rideshare or a taxi. So there's a lot of conversation right now about what the pink tax is, women paying more for products marketed towards women. But I think it's also really important to note just the extra expense that women take just to avoid being assaulted or harassed at night. That really adds up if you're looking at taking ride shares or taxis nightly to avoid an unsafe public transit. So there is other people worldwide working to solve this issue. A lot of studies conducted through the Xyx Lab at Monash University in Australia have been really influential to my work. That report with the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Stats and Research a few years ago, where they did an extensive amount of research involving harassment across Australia's public transit systems, particularly the ones in Melbourne, Sydney. So they created this map where women could go, and through the course of, I believe, a few months, they marked areas that they felt were safe and then unsafe, and marked them as happy or sad areas. And then the researchers at Xyx Lab went through and tried to look for correlations between these markers and the nearby subway stations. And they created some statistics on assault in Australia's public transit systems. So we can see that the majority of sexual assault in New South Wales in a train station takes place in the station itself, not on the particular train car. But other sexual offenses may include verbal harassment, stalking, some kind of like threatening behavior, but not necessarily physical assault, will take place on a train car. So for architects and designers, engineers, it's important to understand where physically in the environment this type of takes place, so we understand what we need to do to stop it. And as shown earlier, this starts with the women when they're very young, and it continues throughout their lives. The type of threat is typically verbal harassment, and this is based off of reports that came in, like crime reports on sexual crimes. So it is mainly verbal harassment, but there is physical assault and other, which stalking or groping might fall under. And the overall location of harassment for most people is on the street and in public spaces, but a quarter of it is transit and travel. And then they looked at the reports, the anecdotal reports that people put in when they were marking these safe and unsafe spaces, and looked for common threads through people's descriptions. So in areas that felt safe to people, a lot of them noted that it was busy or that there was adequate lighting, that they felt a sense of community. So these kind of factors are what people say makes them feel safer. So I wanted to create a set of site conditions that I could use to measure against transit and streetscape areas that have been noted to have high instances of harassment to find some kind of correlation. And then these correlations can specify a set of guidelines similar to LEAD or WELL guidelines but for the use of creating areas that discourage gender-based violence. So I looked at nearby advertisements, hallway width, signage, visibility, just a variety of factors that might come into play. And then I applied them to a series of Australian train stations using architectural drawings where I could find them, and then also photos. So I looked at the North Sydney railway station, which has the lowest rate of offense throughout Australia, which had no reports despite having 13 million interchanges per year on average. And then I looked at the Central Railway Station, which accounts for 13% of all crime reports in New South Wales railway lines. The Flinders Street Railway Station, which women noted as the most unsafe station in Melbourne. The Melbourne Central Railway Station, which women noted as the safest station. And then Waratah Railway Station, which has the highest rate of offenses per passenger interchanges. And the stations that are noted as the most safe are also notably the most modern. That was a takeaway I had from this. However, having strong, consistent lighting is also common throughout the safer stations. And additionally, when it came to materiality, a lot of the more threatening stations were mainly brick, whereas tile and concrete were more common in safer areas. So I don't know if these are factors that are currently really being considered, but it seems to have a correlation when it comes to perceived safety. So I carried that same methodology over to public transit in New York City. So I was able to actually visit these places in person. A large percent of women experience harassment on the New York City subway, over 60%. And the reported sexual offenses in New York public transit have been going up. That number for 2018 is midway through the year. So if that trend continued, we can see that reports have gone up. This could be because people feel safer reporting. But even with that being so, those numbers are far too high. And about 50% of women say that they feel sometimes or frequently threatened with assault on the subway. So I looked at 3 stations within New York City, and each of the stations I looked at different locations throughout them, because a lot of the subway systems are really vast and their environment might change just from one platform to another. So I looked at Grand Central, which had the most reports of sexual assault between 2008 and 2013, sorry. So I looked at the shuttle platform, the hallway in between the platforms, and the platform of the 4, 5, 6, and just made note qualities that seemed to be consistent between this and other stations. So that was usually ceiling height, lighting, visibility. I looked at the Fulton station, which despite being one of New York City's busiest and most recently renovated stations, which are usually correlated with a safer environment, had the highest rate of sexual assault, whereas Grand Central had the highest number, with almost 1 crime per 100,000 trips. So I looked at the platform, their lobby space, and the hallway to the 2 and 3. And then I went to the Atlantic Avenue Barclays Center station in Brooklyn. It has the highest rate of crime around the station compared to any other station within the New York City subway system. However, there were 0 reports of crime within the station itself in the last year. So I looked at the hallway to the 4, 5, 6, the center connecting area, and the hallway to the D and the N and the R. So while more data is still being collected on this, an initial reading of these findings suggests that factors such as visibility, platform width, ceiling heights, lighting, that may all have a correlation to gender-based crimes. So then I want to explore how this affects the streetscape. So by using that variety of crowdsourced databases that chronicle sexual harassment and sexual assault, I'm pinpointing these specific areas. I want to use the maps provided by these databases to specify factors that could create problems and then use that to create architectural guidelines for streetscape design. So I use quality similar to what I was looking at in the train station, visible advertisement, light levels, sidewalk width as opposed to hallway width and quality, density, green space, zoning. One issue I faced when discovering the methodology I was going to use was how to eliminate external factors such as demographics, overall safety of the city. So I took these unsafe areas and then I would go to the nearest safe area. So typically that was within 25, 50 feet, 1 street over that would have no reports compared to an area that had a high density of reports, sometimes up to 15 or 20 on 1 street corner. And I also tried to visit a variety of cities with unique qualities, such as significant university presence versus no university presence, a robust public transit system, because these gender-based crimes we found happen globally. So I think it's important to get an idea of how it affects different types of cities. So this is the application that a lot of the data I collected is received from. So this came out of Monash University in Australia as well. It's called Holoback, and it allows women to go in and mark areas where they've experienced harassment. And you can zoom into a specific corner and read reports that women have added onto this pinpoint. So this is what that application looks like. If I wanted to click more, we could read the entire story of this woman's instance of assault. So the first city I looked at was Seattle. Each profile of these individual cities involves elevation studies that show the locations of various incidents, as well as accompanying descriptions provided by the victim. These incidents are usually categorized as ageism, assault, groping, harassment, indecent exposure, stalking, transphobia, and verbal assault. Seattle was chosen for the study because it has an overall high rate of most crimes, but the rate of sexual crimes is lower than the national average. So a lot of the markers of assault and harassment were clustered around downtown Seattle and the local Queen Anne district. So that's the area I looked at. So you'll see this here, like I've recreated what the streetscape looked like and then placed the women's accounts of assault went in. So there are very graphic descriptions of what's happened to these people. But I just want to get an understanding of what that experience was like and how we can learn from it. And here you can see how violent crime and rape in Seattle stack up against statewide and nationwide averages. And then I looked at Vancouver. I chose Vancouver because there's a rapidly evolving mass public transit system in the form of the SkyTrain, but as well as a significant university presence. But despite these two factors, they have a relatively low rate of sexual assault, even with it being a major city. It's slightly higher than Canada's national average, but lower than it is for most major cities in the country. I did the same through Manhattan, which is one of the most frequently noted cities in that mapping system. They have a unique public transit system that's heavily used and runs 24/7, which is very common in US transit systems. And the location that I chose is in proximity to one of New York City's only true college campuses in NYU. So I thought it was interesting that that was an area where there was a high concentration of accounts of assault. Mm. And I did the same through Brooklyn, through Denver, and through Fort Collins. This is one of the only pinpoints noted in Fort Collins, but I thought it was interesting because it's very suburban compared to the other cities I looked at. It has a really high university presence, and then also, despite it being relatively isolated compared to the other cities, they do have an extensive bus transit system and a train transit system as well. So by looking for consistencies between both the negative and positive qualities in each site, I was able to determine what aspects of design in each area have the greatest effects on that site's safety. The qualities here are listed from the most to least reoccurring in order to make sense of how influential each quality was. By doing so, I was able to determine what should be considered when designing both streetscapes and public areas, particularly transit stations. The results of this analysis are the basis for the creation of guidelines that I'm currently working on for a safer streetscape. And then I wanted to look into how that could apply to the redesign of the space. So as a way of demonstrating the effects of these considerations, I worked with a design partner, her name's Altagracia Ferreira, when I was doing my undergraduate thesis. And we worked to design a train station in Morris Park, both before and after my research, so I could compare what those two designs would look like. We were using the same floor area, the same program, the same location. The only thing that was changing in the two designs was an understanding of what created a more inclusive and safe space. So on the left, you'll see the former design. On the right, you'll see the latter. And we not only looked at the research that I did, but we looked at the research of other people exploring what makes a public space. One of them is Dr. Diane Davis, who is a professor at Harvard University, who found that allowing citizens to gain ownership of the space in their community and allowing the possibility of flexible public spaces, residents are more likely to participate in a socially just manner because they feel like the space belongs to them. So design really focused on just something that was flexible, would allow people to come in and exhibit their own work. There could be markets, just the idea that it would belong to the community ended up being really influential in the final design. And then here just outlined how our considerations came into play. Sidewalks were widened, we elevated the rail line, which was consistent with a safer streetscape in some of the cities we looked at. We designed new crosswalks leading to the station and added exterior lighting. And then some of the transit guidelines we looked at were raising the ceilings so they were consistent with what we saw in safer stations. We put a mixture of natural light as well as many fixtures to create a really strongly lit train station. The interior is visible from one end to another, and then the use of light-colored reflective materials lends itself to a safer space. So this is what that final design ended up looking like. And this is where the phase of my work that took place within NYIT ended. But I've transported it now to my work at the Graduate School Design. And I want to explore how, in concurrence with other fields of academia, such as law and public policy, how can we help carry out the considerations of a safer and more gender-inclusive streetscape? So I'd like to quickly share one of my more recent projects, which is heavily reliant on ArcGIS, which is a geographic information system, which works with maps and geographic info, as well as publicly available data for the cities of Cambridge and Boston, Massachusetts. So in an effort to kind of visualize how perilous the actions of this one mapping class students are, we located their proximity to recent reports of crimes of theft, assault, and car accident. So that's what you're seeing here. The red dots are reports of crime throughout the past year in these cities. The blue line is one specific student path, and the larger red circles represent the closest incidents of crime. So we did this process for 68 students who used GPS applications to map a typical daily route for them. And then we noted what activities they did throughout the day and where. And then we went in, and these are all 68 students ranked from most to least danger prone based off of their daily route and proximity to crime. And then each slide, it shows a location of crime, but it also shows a location of every street and park lamp registered in Cambridge. So we want to use that information to see if there's any correlation between how safe or unsafe someone is and compared to how well lit their path of travel is. And what we're currently doing now is pulling these slides out and showing correlations between gender, maybe what program they're enrolled in, seeing if there's a correlation between what someone's identity is and then how safe their path of travel is. So I want to conclude with just asking, how do we move forward with this information now? I think the first step is, as people that are either in architecture, urban design, or inclusive fields of work, I think we have to admit to ourselves that design isn't inclusive yet. And while my work focuses specifically on gender, ability, race, there's so many other factors that are often overlooked in design because we think that we're designing for one universal citizen. I think there absolutely is space for all of us to do better, but that requires considering how each individual moves through the spaces that we're creating and listening to voices of people that aren't represented in the design field.
That is just amazing. I see so many possibilities for the research that you've applied, and I'd like to talk to you about that in a minute. Just a couple of things I want to underline is, in a separate conference, we're going to talk about crowdsourcing of data and the power of crowdsourcing information. And you've really showed such a coherent applied example of why feedback matters. And, you know, rather than, you know, I think all of us are the best sensors. And so providing feedback in that kind of a forum is great. And I see the possibilities. Like, imagine if Google could instruct you on how to travel to work based on the safest route, right? Based on incidences reported in the past. And I'm just saying, like, that whole journey mapping that you've done and identifying where people are putting themselves at the most risk through their, or maybe getting an alert if you're going through a high risk area or something like that. Like, I really see a lot of proactive ways of building in public safety into guiding people in wayfinding, but as well as design. That's the human side. The second thing is, I'm really impressed, and I'd like to talk to you more around the design standards and how you're holding design accountable for safety and performance and ongoing evolution. So once a location has been built, it's been architected, designed and built, but then how do we hold that place accountable for ongoing iteration and improvement based on actual human experience? So I really love the closed loop of accountability that you have on design and architecture, Gabrielle. It's really very interesting. And you're adding a whole other dimension that I think is so relevant in the future of your profession, is accountable design. And I thank you for that. Now I'm going to ask you a couple of questions.
Absolutely.
What are you going to, like, what do you hope to achieve with this research? I'm just so impressed with your progress, but what's the end goal for you? Like, what would be success for you? And once you've synthesized all this information, what are you trying to do next?
So what my next goal would be is to create a series of guidelines that can be made part of the required practice for architects and designers. So we're seeing LEED now and WELL as kind of a stamp of approval on a building.
Mhm.
I think this should really be kind of equivalent with code, because it's such a massive issue. So I'd really like to create these guidelines, have them be thorough enough that they can be sent out as a requirement for all architects and design firms to have to consider. Um, but beyond that, I just want to open up this conversation that is happening kind of in whispers. But I think that, like, the people that are working on it, I think we have the ability to kind of open up a new field of work. We've seen just in the past couple decades how big environmentally sustainable design has become. That's created its own field. Now workplace design has become kind of its own field. How do we make people happier in workspaces? And I think that the idea of, like, gender inclusive and feminist public space has the ability to be given that same amount of attention. I think it needs that same amount of attention. So that's what I would eventually really like to see happen and be a part of, is opening up and recruiting like this new group of designers that are coming out. We see more women graduating from architecture school now than men are. So I think it's a really great time to open up this new field of work.
I couldn't agree with you more. You're both with technology as well as a lot more focus on the humans in the built environment, right? Like, I think traditionally, if I look even 10 years ago, it was about real estate and assets. And now I see a pivot that real estate professionals are talking about productivity and how we enable the humans to be well and sustainable, and nudging them towards practices that will help improve their lives and give them balance. It's become much more human centric versus building centric. So I just think that you're really coming into such an important and relevant time where we're going to slingshot away from our focus on the traditional concrete and mortar to one around how we're designing for the human experience and how we're iterating for a changing human experience, whatever those needs are. And, I really thank you for taking a topic that's perhaps in the subconscious of many people's minds into the conscious mind, because it all starts with that. You're really putting a bullseye on this topic. And as soon as you start to do that and share some of the studies that you've done, some of the research that you've done, it really helps people in practice understand and figure out how we can manifest that and embed it into what we're doing. It's not just a topic talked about on the side, it's actually embedded and operationalized into everything that we do. And you start that by taking it out of the unconscious mind into the conscious mind. And I love your goal.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful, I think, to this new movement. Like, the Me Too movement has been so influential in bringing out this conversation overall, and we've seen it make major changes in the way the entertainment industry is run and the arts industry. So I think it's, like, right at the edge of breaking into this architecture and design. And I think we're already just, like, starting to see the conversation of, like, a fair firm culture in architecture, and gender inclusive firm culture. So I'm just hoping they can transition that conversation now into how we actually practice. But yeah, I'm really grateful that I think the time right now is perfect, because it is, like, a conversation that's being had, just not specifically in the design field in a way fully applicable yet. I think it's getting there.
I think so too, and I hope today is will continue to cascade your message and reach your audience of people that you're trying to reach, and grab people's curiosity so that they can learn more. If people want to reach you, and either through social media or just learn a little bit more or offer their assistance to you, how would they go about doing that, Gabrielle?
So I am on LinkedIn. That is where I post the majority of my current work, and I'd love to have conversations with people if they're interested in it, because that is such a big goal. What I want to do is get people interested in this, because once we're interested, we start thinking about it consciously, and that'll transfer into the work we're doing. So yeah, Gabrielle Redding on LinkedIn. I'd really love to converse with people more about this.
All right. If you are out there and you love her topic and you think you can help and support her, please do reach out to her on LinkedIn. Any parting comments before we sign off today, Gabrielle? I just loved your topic, and thank you so much for such a coherent explanation of a topic that I think will only cascade into more interest to our profession. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think this is really great, because I think giving a platform to people that don't necessarily fit the typical traditional aesthetic of what an architect might look like is one of the first steps. So I'm really grateful to have this opportunity for the other women involved in this to have the opportunity to share their work. I think it's a really big step in moving forward.
Well, we're delighted to be a stepping stone in your journey. I really do sincerely feel you're such an incredible future leader. And you're already a leader, as I said, but I please, if I can do anything to support you in your endeavors, you know I'm here for you. So keep going. I love your topic, and I'll do anything I can to help you. And good luck at school. I hope to see you down there at some point. And that's all I've got for now. That's it for this episode of Leading Innovation at Work. This is Lorri Rollinson signing off for now. I hope this information has served you and provided practical tips to help you go out and lead change, understand new topics, operationalize them, and make a difference in our industry today.